A very good evening to you and welcome to this Friday's edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. Well, Parliament's third term came to a rather abrupt end today following last week's Constitutional Court judgment on local government elections. MPs today formally began what's no doubt going to be a very hectic 7-week schedule as they start campaigning for their respective political parties. Now, tonight on the program, we look at how South Africans may vote in the November 1 election from the latest available poll that was conducted last month and whose results were made public a few days ago. Our panel looks at the political landscape that has influenced citizens' attitudes towards this election, as well as the state of the political players set to shape the poll's outcome. That and more coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. Ipsos, the world's largest market research company, interviewed about 1,500 randomly chosen South Africans last month. And to briefly take us through the results, we are joined on the line by Ipsos SA Director Mari Harris, who unfortunately couldn't join us via Zoom or Skype because of connectivity issues at the tourist resort from where she is speaking to us. Evening, Mari. Hope you are enjoying your short left, and envious and jealous as I am, I'm not going to spoil your experience by taking too much of your time. But very briefly, how did you conduct this poll?
Hello, Vuyo. Yes, and I hope the lines roll, that all of you can hear them as well. But anyway, we did the interviews by phone, so it was a CATI study. 96% of South African adults, those who are eligible to vote, in other words, above the age of 18, have access to a mobile phone. So we used a program called random digit dialing, where the computer selects numbers, dials the numbers, and then the person on the other side of the line, the respondent answers, and the person on our side of the line does the interview. So they all speak to a warm-blooded person and not to a machine. But the interviews were done from the 16th to the 20th of August, so we can do quite a large number of interviews in a week if you do this type of study.
Was it very different, the way you did it this time, that is, from how you've done other polls previously?
Well, currently we do have a poll in the field, a normal, well, not normal is perhaps not the right word, a face-to-face study that is 3,500 interviews that takes 6 weeks to do if you do it all over the country, even into deep rural areas. So with the telephone, it's much faster. Obviously, you cannot reach everybody in the country. As I said, 96% have access to phones. But we did CATI polls before, for instance, in the 2016 national elections. We did CATI polls in the major metropolitan areas. And we worked with ENTA at that stage, and they predicted the outcomes of the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, Johannesburg Metro, and Tshwane Metro correctly based on the polls we conducted by CATI.
Okay, so in a sense, I mean, you've employed a lot of sort of tried and tested methods. Take us through the what came out very briefly.
Yes, of the population, because in the end you end up with a population sample. Of the population, 70%, 71% said that they want to vote in the election. So I'm going to share results with you of that 71% who said that they wanted to vote in the election, because we know that there is a certain feeling of voter apathy still in the country. We are not yet sure how many people are going to vote. A little bit closer to the election, we'll be able to do more accurate sums about how many people are going to vote and where the turnout might be bigger or smaller. But one thing to remember is that turnouts for local government elections are usually smaller than for national elections. So with everything said, currently the ANC polls at 49.3%, the DA at 17.9%, the EFF at 14.5%. Then we have four parties that are between 1 and 2%. The Action SA and the ACDP both at 1.5%, IFP at 1.4%, and the Freedom Front Plus at 1.2%. There's also people mentioned a lot of other parties. 5.3% of people mentioned other parties, and none of these parties were mentioned by enough people to register 1% of the votes. But I must say they were the Patriotic Alliance, the Dikwan-Kwetla Party, the Black First Land First, Good, Bosbok Rand Ratepayers Association. So a very wide variety of other parties were mentioned by a few people only. And then some people felt that their vote was confidential. They are still uncertain who to vote for. And then 2.5% refused to share their opinion with us. So that's just a fast summary of the 71% who said that they want to vote in this election on the 1st of November.
Anything from those numbers that we've gone through that sort of particularly struck you as being interesting or strange, surprising?
I think the one thing that was a bit surprising is that Action SA scored the 1.5%. It's a new party. There's very little campaigning done. I was surprised about that. And then I also looked at the figures for the country as a whole. That is, if everybody votes. And we can definitely see that if everybody votes, then there are more people who say things like they would voting makes no change. They would tell you that they won't go and vote because voting makes no change. They would tell you that they don't trust political parties or politicians, and so on. I was also surprised at the relatively good performance of both the DA and the EFF. Because remember, we watch polls all the time. So not only close to elections, I was looking at results every 6 months since the previous elections. And both the DA and the EFF did better than what they did in polls in December last year, when we also asked people how they would vote in the local government elections. So I was not that surprised by the ANC going under the 50% because we could see the downward slope over the last number of surveys that we did. And in December last year, they polled at 51.8%. So, I thought, okay, fine, it can either stay there or it will go just under the 50%. But I must stress that the most important thing that will influence these results will be the turnout.
Mara Harris, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Vuyo.
And to enjoy your weekend at Kruger National Park. Now, in a short while, our panel is going to interrogate some of that information that you saw there with the aid of graphics. But before we do that, we're going to quickly look at what some of the political parties were doing today in preparation for the next hectic 7 weeks that they'll be using to campaign for that November 1 poll. While the ANC election team spent the day behind closed doors, finalizing their election campaign strategy, outside Luthuli House, a group of around 100 ANC members from Tshwane were protesting. The group is calling on members of the NEC to investigate the candidate list of councillors which has been put forward for the upcoming local government elections. They claim that many people have been fraudulently put on the list. The third largest opposition party, I should say, in the country, the EFF, launched its campaign for the 2021 local government elections in Alexandra, north of Johannesburg. It has raised concerns over campaigning under COVID-19 lockdown regulations.
The EFF is in an election campaign. The Constitutional Court said we must proceed with the elections. Afterward advised that we should avoid the super spread events. Election by their own nature, they attract numbers. We cannot regulate numbers because we run a risk of offending our own supporters.
Well, lots of other hopefuls were in meetings and getting up and preparing for the campaigning period. Among them, New Kid on the Block Action SA, led by former Mayor of Johannesburg, Herman Mashaba. They launched their campaign saying their strategy is to contest where they are guaranteed a win.
We've taken a clear, deliberate decision to contest municipalities where we know we're going to win and be in government. Because politics is about actually being in government, not to be the one actually providing employment opportunities to councillors. No, we want to really be in government. That is why we decided on this approach to contest municipalities where we know we will be government.
The official opposition, the DA, will be launching its vision for the biggest metro in the country, the city of Johannesburg. Joining the party's mayoral candidate, Mpho Phalatse, will be the party's leader, John Steenhuisen, and the party's Gauteng leader, Soli Msimang. We're going to take a quick ad break. After that break, our team of analysts weigh in on the issues raised by that Ipsos poll, but they also look at the state of the political parties. Don't go away. Let's welcome our panelists for this evening. Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, Ongama Mtimka, and Precious Lugayeni. Good evening to all three of you, and thank you so much for coming through for us this evening, our first election-related program.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Well, I want to start by...
Good evening.
Good evening, Pro. I'm going to start by looking at, that Ipsos poll says is the way South Africans could largely vote if an election was to be held tomorrow, and assuming, I think, a 70 or thereabout percent people would be able to vote. I hope we can be able to bring that graphic up, because I'm not seeing any very sort of real surprises there, but you can correct me. I mean, if I'm wrong, I mean that poll suggests that about 49%, of people would in fact vote for the ANC. Does that surprise you, Professor Maluleke?
No, not at all. I think it is very close to the 2016 election number, although it is a little lower than what the ANC managed to achieve. I think the big thing in this prediction is that the ANC is probably going to fall below 50. That's the big issue. Is it really going to fall below 50? We will have to wait and see. Other aspects of this poll are actually very generous. I mean, to suggest that 7 out of 10 people will go out and vote is a bit too rich for me.
And it's interesting how they put it, Prof. It's interesting how they put it. They say that is a, quote unquote, a more realistic view. And it's interesting that you think it's a bit generous on the other hand.
Well, I mean, last time there were nearly 20 million South Africans who did not vote. And they didn't vote either because they did not turn up or they simply didn't even register to vote. So I don't know how we are going to change that number drastically. I mean, so basically, out of 40 million South Africans who can vote now, this survey seems to suggest that more than 30 million will go out and vote, roughly. I don't know that is likely to happen.
Ongama Mtimka, I mean, they also suggest, or that poll also suggests that support for both the DA and the EFF is in double figures. The DA at 17.9% and the EFF at 14.5%.
Well, Bravoyo, I think it's important to note that these polls are only useful, in my view, to the extent that they give us a dipstick of the mood of a country at a particular time. But they can never outweigh the value that we get from election data itself. So, for example, just to agree with what Prof was saying earlier on the story of turnout purely, I mean, in the 2016 election, we saw a further decline in turnout from roughly about 58.2% in 2011 to about 56. So one would expect that trend to continue. As far as the DA support is concerned, the bigger story here is that both the DA and the ANC are in trouble. That's the key message. And as a result of that trouble, political parties like the Freedom Front Plus and other smaller parties are gaining significant traction, and therefore it explains why, for example, Action SA is coming on board. One party that I'm not surprised is growing is the EFF, partly because in 2016, the EFF took a strategic decision and not accepted to become part of formal oppositions of formal coalitions in any of the municipalities throughout the country. What that did from a strategic games perspective is that it continued to frame the EFF as not necessarily in the government fray. And or the same way that a reserve player would be seen, that it's not being judged on the basis of its failures in government, but more on the basis of its potential as an alternative, particularly to the ANC. And that's why, Bravoyo, the EFF is actually very much keen on not seeing the ANC being allowed to register, because as we have seen in Utenake, for example, in Kariega, in KwaNobuhle, any bungle of a voting, of a registration process on the part of the ANC, mostly in ANC constituencies, is an automatic victory for the EFF. So, it's growing marginally, and I think that part of its growth has got to do with the fact that it's not suffering the same internal implosion that the ANC and the Democratic Alliance are suffering.
And then, Precious, according to this poll, you then have all these parties that are around, 1.5% and below. Long list of them that a lot of people seem determined to vote for.
Well, thank you, Vuyo. You see, first of all, let me comment on the issue of the turnout. I think also 70% is too generous. The smaller parties will get votes because of the problems in the bigger parties. Like Ongama has said, that the ANC and the DA are in trouble, and therefore people might go to the smaller parties. However, the results of the poll are not surprising at all. They indicate that the ANC will still get the majority of the votes, even if they fall from 53% they got last time in 2016. In 2016, the ANC was down from 61.95% to 53.9% overall. So we can expect it to go down a bit, but otherwise it will still be the majority party in the results. But the smaller parties do play a role. You remember that in Nelson Mandela, for example, they depended on that, the one smaller party when they elected a mayor. So the smaller parties do have a role to play. But Action SA is different in the sense that Helman Mashaba was well received when he was in the DA. And then he might get some votes because he's Helman Mashaba. And the DA also will be affected by the issue of Musi Maimane, how he left. But otherwise, smaller parties do have a role to play, though they waste some votes sometimes, that the votes go to the smaller parties when those smaller parties do not make any significant change in the results.
Now, what's also interesting, or what is particularly interesting for me from this poll, Professor Maluleke, is how then people were also used this, or at least what came through from this is people registering their grievances. I hope we're going to be able to bring up this graphic here. When people were asked which political party would you vote for, and if you do not choose a party, why not? And this is where a lot of people's grievances then came through. Things like, I have no interest in voting in this election. I will vote for whoever wants to do the job and run the country properly. I will vote for any party as long as it is not the ANC. I'm unemployed. Why should I vote? All of that, of course, not surprising, because these are things that people have been talking about, Prof, isn't it?
Yes, Vuyo, there's a lot of unhappiness out there. And the unhappiness of the voters obviously will be directed mostly against the big parties, because those were the parties which had the power to do something for the voters and seem not to have done anything substantial. So I want to suggest that these few complaints that we see there are really a drop in the ocean. I think that there is a lot of unhappiness. 27 years since democracy, this will be local election number 6. 5 elections have already happened, and people have very little to show for it. There was hope that perhaps the coalition government would bring some solution, but even there, we saw metros and municipalities that were co-governed, getting bogged down into all manner of wrangling, mainly for control of the budget, control of the purse. And so I think voters realize that, most of the time they are on their own, And I think they will use the vote to try and send a message to the big parties. That's really what it says, because you can see there's mention of the ANC in particular. But basically, I think it is grievances directed at the 3 or 4 big parties in the country, because those did have some control in many municipalities and metros.
Of course, Precious, I mean, voters have expressed their discontent, before. And yes, we saw, decreases in voter turnout if you look at 2016 and 2019. But, I mean, the showing was still, better than you would expect. And people voted more or less, for, the same parties.
I think it's an issue maybe of it's better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. But like Prof is saying, there's a lot of unhappiness out there. And the main one is the issue of unemployment. The young people who are encouraged to vote are the ones who are disgruntled because they are unemployed. There's no hope for them. So that is why I don't believe that though the time is short and the political parties want to campaign, that's why I don't believe that people of South Africa still vote because of the campaign. They are unhappy, like Prof is saying. They know what these parties should have done and have not done. Whether they campaign or not, I don't think that will change the result.
Of course, Ongama, we should also put it on record, or at least not pretend that, if there's a lower turnout, then it'll be the first time. Traditionally, voter turnout in local government elections is usually, lower compared to national and provincial elections, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is, Prof. Vuyo. So, and the thing is that the DA, for the longest part, focused this strategy purely on turnout. So what happened is that the DA in its own strongholds got a lot more votes than the ANC did in its own strongholds. On top of that, because we're using a proportional representation system rather than a first past the post or winner takes all approach, the votes that the DA got in ANC constituencies, no matter how small they were, served to create a very interesting dynamic in councils, where you found that, for example, although the DA did not win by getting more constituencies, it actually got more PR seats, because in our method of counting votes in South Africa, a party does not lose those votes that are cast in a constituency which is not their strongholds. So it was not uncommon, for example, to see the ANC having more wards in a municipality, but still have lesser seats than the DA because of that strategy, which is focused on turnout. It's going to be interesting now that turnout, in my view, is going to be actually, it likely may be worse of an issue given the COVID-19 pandemic than is suggested by the survey.
Now, Prof, I want us to go back to the last Auditor General report, which painted a very sorry and dire picture of local government. It's a spectacularly bad performance from this cohort that is outgoing. They are leaving local government worse than they found it back in 2016. Of course, politics being politics, do you think people are going to punish this entire group or all these parties, or they will tend to go for, and this is a point, of course, you made earlier, a particular party or parties, by way of punishment, if at all?
Well, Vuyo, I sometimes think that the relationship between the South African voter and the political party, especially in local government elections, is a sick one. It's a codependent relationship. it is based on lying to one another, if one can put it like that. People now know, 5 elections later, they know that very little of the promises that are being made are going to be fulfilled. They have seen it in the Auditor General's report. They have watched it in the wranglings that have been going on in their municipalities. They know that they don't have water. I mean, if 27 years later, 5 elections later, you don't have a street where you live, you don't have water where you live, you still rely on pit latrines, what is it that is going to convince you that this time around your vote will make a difference? So I think what is happening here is that it's a codependent, sick relationship. The voters need the political parties in a sick kind of way, and the political parties need the voters in a sick kind of way. So they march together forward into a future that is bleak, and everyone knows that this thing is not working very well at all. I don't know whether it is just the electoral system or it is merely that the politicians really have not put any effort to address the needs of the people. So I think that people will vote for their traditional political parties, not out of enthusiasm, not out of a lot of hope, but out of desperation and out of this sick relationship that they have with those political parties. Sorry to sound so gloomy.
Precious, I mean, added to those service delivery failures broadly that Prof spoke about, I mean, though the Auditor General report also went into detail about, financial losses, fraud and corruption, the misuse of public resources, lack of skills, and of course the politics that tend to, influence or take precedent over the resolution of those issues. Precious, did you hear that?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I was saying, in addition to, the water, sanitation, housing, and other issues that Prof. Maluleke was talking about, there was another long list, of failures that the Auditor General report, spoke about, from financial losses, fraud and corruption, the misuse of public resources, and so on.
Thank you, Vuyo. Corruption is a big issue that is bigger now than it has ever been before. And also what people know now that they did not know before. We all know that there was corruption, but we did not know the magnitude of corruption until we had the Zondo Commission. So the voters have that information at their disposal. In terms of the results of the Auditor General, irregular expenditure was a big thing in the municipalities. But nothing happens to those municipalities. Nothing happens. No one is taken to task because of the bad audit report. So the voters know those things, and they will not. Of course, there is a big majority of the voters who will still vote regardless of those things. To them, maybe sometimes they don't even know what the results of the Auditor General is. But in cities and the metros, that will be important, because the ANC is not doing well in the big metros. That is why in the last elections in 2016, the ANC lost 3 metros. We don't know what is going to happen now. And remember, in 2016, the issues in the ANC were not as bad as they are now. Even the factions were not as pronounced as they are now. Issues of corruption, irregular expenditure, wasteful expenditure are big in the Auditor General's report, and that is what the voters know. And they will base their decisions on that. Hence, I said earlier, I don't believe that the voters need a campaign. They know issues as they are.
I mean, voters may not know, as Precious says, but there is always, and the Auditor General reports say this, there's always a correlation between financial management, or shall we say bad financial management, and service delivery.
Sure, there would be Vuyo. So
yeah, because I mean, often those who manage the finances badly are more often than not those who actually don't deliver to the people. That's the point I'm making here.
Sure. So let's look at it, how it happens in practice. And this is part of the political economy of local government procurement. What you find is that once, and by the way, we need to talk about state capture at a local level. Once you get municipalities run by a nexus between politicians and officials, which represents a grouping that repurposes the functions of the state, or at a purely corruption level, where you find that contractors that are not supposed to be contracted, that don't have the skills or the capital or any capability to deliver, get appointed to deliver. And part of the culture is the swindling out of resources from the fiscus, the tendency to seek rents, the tendency to collapse municipalities with an intention purely of redirecting its finances towards corruption. So you will find that wasteful expenditure is high in those municipalities. Also, you will find that there's a lot of wasteful and fruitless expenditure, but also bad procurement practices, which then mean that it's not a mistake, it's by design that those municipalities where there's bad financial management do not perform. That's precisely because they are crippled so that they serve the agenda that captures those municipalities. And what you find is that even there's failure to address remedial action from the Auditor General. And the reason why there's that failure is because the same groupings that control the regional power block remains intact. And when the ANC intervenes at a national level, they don't intervene in the way that is in the best interest of that municipality. But you will find that ANC politicians will treat with kid gloves anyone who is aligned to their factional agenda or in the broader succession politics of the country. So it's a deep crisis that is multifaceted.
Okay. We're going to take a quick ad break. When we return, we'll look at how the categories of political players that we have in this election may influence the outcome of that November 1 poll. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Watchdog, and if you've just joined us, Parliament's third term came to an end today, and following last week's constitutional judgment on local government elections, MPs today formally began what's no doubt going to be a very hectic 7-week schedule as they start campaigning for their respective political parties. And tonight on the program, we're looking at how South Africans may vote in the November 1, something we've been doing via or through by looking at that the latest available poll that was conducted last month and whose results were made public only a few days ago. Our panel now is looking at the political landscape on the back of that poll, and we're trying to see how this particular poll may just turn out given what we know now about what citizens prefer and what may just influence their attitudes towards the political players they may have to vote for. And right now, lady and gentlemen, I want us to look very briefly at the political players that will be participating in this election, starting, if I may, with the ANC. It's been through a lot over the past 5 years of local government, and as a party, it's seen quite a number of challenges, but it's also started to at least, try and do something about the things that it has been criticized for. Do you think, Professor Maluleke, that what we've seen, via your state capture inquiries, what we've seen in Parliament since Cyril Ramaphosa took over, what we've been seeing in and outside of the courts, will, in whatever way, improve the fortunes of the ANC, which has been on a downward slide, it must be said?
Yes, look, the ANC has, of course, the most to answer for the situation in which the country is in, both in local government but also in national government. And for that reason, they bear the greatest responsibility. And so we have seen gallant efforts from the current administration to address some of the problems, the step-aside rule, that has been there. We have seen high-profile arrests and cases, and of course we have the Zondo Commission, which the ANC will always claim to have occurred because of its own initiative, although former public protector would probably contest that. So we will have to wait and see if the ANC has done enough to change perception. My own view is that it hasn't. I think that perhaps what we now have are the beginnings of a change of direction for the ANC, but nothing secured really. No guarantees that the ANC has really changed its ways, especially at the local level. I don't think that local level voters will be able to feel the difference that Ramaphosa has made yet, and his team. Mm-hmm. And if anything, they may feel that things have gone worse in some institutions, as some of my colleagues were pointing out now. So my own sense is that the ANC is going to lose a lot, but the ANC has a lot of what I call political overdraft. And at what point does the ANC run out of that overdraft? And very few other organizations among the list that we see now have as much overdraft as the ANC has. And what is that overdraft? It's their brand. It's Nelson Mandela. It's Oliver Tambo. It's the history that they have. And the fact that many people will vote for the ANC without thinking, mm-hmm. even in the face of contradictory evidence. So will the overdraft still sustain them? We'll have to wait and see.
Precious, from where you sit?
Hello?
From where you sit, will the ANC, how do you think the ANC will perform? Do you think they have done enough over the past 5 years of local government to improve their chances this time around?
Well, in local government, they have not done as well as we wanted them to do. But coming to your point that you made earlier of the players that are trying in the ANC, trying maybe to deal with corruption, for example, like the step-aside rule that Professor Maluleke has talked about. But in that process of trying to clean, they become more divided. That is their problem. And they don't even agree on whether this step-aside rule or the manner in which they deal with corruption is correct. They don't agree on all those things. And the voters can see that. However, like Prof is saying that the ANC enjoys an overdraft, but an overdraft comes to an end at some point. They will still do well, but maybe not as well as we thought. But let's wait and see.
Ongama, your thoughts on this question? Ongama, are you still with us?
If the ship is sinking, yes, I'm still with you, Prof.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, if the ship is sinking, acts of saving people, doing whatever one can in order to, try and help the situation, sometimes only serve to slow down the pace of that, not necessarily the sinking itself. So what I would like to say is that the great things the ANC has done in terms of, for example, improving the candidate selection processes for ward councillors, that's very good, but it's a contested process. So all that it will simply do, along with the national changes that have been made, will be to slow down the rate of the extent to which the ANC is going to lose, as opposed to, completely reversing that trend. That's my view, and it has nothing to do really with the leaders that are there currently. It has everything to do with the fact that, as Victor Hugo says, an invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an idea whose time has come. And it seems like the voter behavior in South Africa since 2009, by the way, has incrementally been becoming a lot more sensitive to things like regime performance than it was in the earlier years of our democracy.
Professor Maluleke, considering what has been happening, in metros like Nelson Mandela Bay, like Tshwane, what do you think is going to happen to parties, or in particular, the DA and the EFF? And I will also hasten to add Johannesburg as well, because the two parties and how they have been, playing the game over the past 5 years introduced a lot of things, but also brought about new sets of problems as well. How do you see, things panning out this time around?
Well, coalition is the future, obviously. So I think there'll be a lot more need for coalition governments. I don't think the voters are handing victory to any single party just like that. The problem is that sometimes coalition governments become collision governments. They collide with one another. And we have seen them collide with one another a few times. And I expect that will happen. The other strategy is that the big parties will now have to gather a lot more smaller parties around them in order to be able to govern. If the 4 or 3 big parties are unable to collaborate. And of course, here is Herman Mashaba, the Donald Trump of our politics, and he may upset the situation in Tshwane and in Johannesburg. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But I think coalition is the future, and the parties will have to be careful, because clearly what they want is control, especially control of the finances, and that in the process of looking for control, they don't forget about the voters, because at the moment in South Africa, the voters have every reason to feel that 5 elections later, they have been forgotten, because you can't explain to an ordinary South African why 5 elections later they still don't have water. You can't explain to the people of Hammanskraal why their water is so dirty 5 elections later. So I hope that the politics of local elections and local governance do not take the parties further away from the needs of the voters. But coalition, I think, is the only way in the future.
Ongamam Timka, I want to talk specifically about, I want to ask you specifically about the DA, because there are a lot of instances that some of you felt it had mishandled, these coalitions, or at least didn't use the advantages they managed to secure at the beginning to their advantage. As a result, the coalitions became the collisions that Professor Maluleke is talking about. What do you think they have learned or ought to have learned from this experience?
I think that if, for example, we take Nelson Mandela Bay, you take Gauteng, before, that fallout between Herman Mashaba and the New Democratic Alliance, it would probably be that in choosing leaders, it's important to choose people who can work with others in these municipalities. And two, it's important to have a working framework of resolution of conflict and disputes, and also that managing coalitions is a lot more messy. So the DA's stance of wanting to come in and actually be the main driver of coalitions is not going to fly with the smaller parties. And in fact, they have made that point where the relationships have been sustained. Like, for example, in Nelson Mandela Bay, notwithstanding the fact that the relationships between the UDM and the DA were fraught at some stage, emphasis on good management, political management, helped to sustain some of the relationship. I mean, the relationship with ACDP, D.O.P, among others, was sustained over time with very minimal threats to those relationships. So I think that it's the biggest takeaway in the post-2016 era is that the ability to sustain coalitions is as much about the styles of leadership of those who lead as it is about the attitude that is shown by the party itself in terms of what it interprets to be its role in the coalition.
Precious, in the 30 or so seconds that we have, the EFF factor, where do you see them going this time around, given, in their case too, the experiences of the past 5 years?
Well, I don't think the EFF is, like Mtimka said earlier, that they are interested in having a municipality they run on their own. I think they because they don't want to be associated with failure where it occurs. I don't think they will
and they're being realistic, in the sense that they actually don't have the numbers. So,
but even if they had the numbers, the DA didn't have much numbers, but they managed to get those 3 metros. But even those 3 metros that the DA got is because the ANC had some problems. They remember in Tshwane, for example, they did not want a mayoral candidate. The people of Tshwane said they don't want a mayoral candidate, but this mayoral candidate was forced on them, and then they did not vote. So the EFF, it remains to be seen. In the national government elections, they increased nicely from 6.3% to 10%, more than 10%. So I don't think they will run a municipality. I cannot foresee them running a municipality. But the comment I want to make real quickly is the issue of the coalitions that Professor Maluleke is talking about. My opinion is that the coalitions have not worked in the past 5 years. We have seen chaos throughout since they started up to now. Tshwane, if what happened in Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay is anything to go by, I don't know whether as South Africans we are ready for coalitions or we understand what it means to be in a coalition with a party. Like Ongama is saying that the style of leadership and the preparedness to work with other people is key for a coalition. I don't think we are ready for the coalition because in Tshwane, for example, even the ANC was disruptive there. They would walk out so that there's no quorum. They will do all those kinds of things, which I think were problematic. But also, the EFF is not going to help them to sit on the fence and say we don't want to run a municipality because they don't want to be associated with failure. That will not work for them in the long run.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. Special thanks to our panelists, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, Precious Lukayeni, and Ongama Mtimka. And that's where we're going to leave it this evening. Do join us again on Monday, 8 o'clock sharp. Have a good night and a great weekend.